The air in the solicitor's office was thick, heavy with the scent of old paper and suppressed greed. It was a suffocatingly formal space, all dark mahogany and leather, a perfect stage for the final act of a lifetime of quiet resentment. This was the reading of my Uncle Silas's will, and every member of my extended family, the aunts, the cousins, the in-laws, was present, dressed in their finest, trying desperately to appear mournful while silently calculating their potential windfall. I, however, felt genuine loss, though Silas and I had only shared a quiet, distant bond built on mutual respect rather than constant closeness. He had been the family's eccentric, the one who never chased material wealth, but always seemed perfectly content tinkering away in his garage, surrounded by tools and half-finished inventions. Now, his estate, a substantial portfolio built through shrewd, almost invisible investments, was up for grabs. I sat in the back, trying to shrink into the heavy velvet of the chair, knowing I was the outsider, the prodigal niece who hadn't conformed to the family's expectations of corporate success and country club memberships. My cousins, particularly Marcus, the self-proclaimed heir apparent, kept glancing back at me, a subtle sneer playing on his lips. They expected me to get a token, a sentimental antique perhaps, nothing of real value. And honestly, I expected the same. I was just there out of respect for Silas, hoping for a final kind word from a man who had been one of the few stable figures in my tumultuous life. Mr. Henderson, the solicitor, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of professional neutrality, cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. He started listing bequests, the sprawling estate to Marcus naturally, along with a sizable trust fund, the art collection to Aunt Vivian, the classic car to Cousin Eleanor. The list went on and on, detailing millions in assets, jewels, and properties. Each announcement was met with a chorus of whispered congratulations and murmured thanks, the tension in the room steadily ratcheting up, tightening around my chest. I felt a familiar pang of inadequacy, realizing how far I still was from achieving the kind of financial security my family took for granted. I mentally prepared myself for the inevitable small, irrelevant item. A book, a piece of old furniture, something easily forgotten. Then Mr. Henderson paused, looking directly at me over the rim of his spectacles. His voice, usually so measured, took on a slightly peculiar tone, almost amused. "And finally, to Miss Alara Vance," he announced, the name echoing slightly louder than the others, drawing all eyes toward me. Marcus actually let out a small, audible scoff, quickly smothered by his hand. "To Alara, my dear niece, I leave the entirety of the contents of the safe deposit box, number 417, at the Second National Bank, and the one item she always admired, the toolbox from my workbench." The room erupted, not in anger, but in derisive laughter. A toolbox. A greasy, old, rusty toolbox that sat under his workbench, covered in sawdust and oil stains. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice dripping with condescension. "A toolbox? Seriously, Silas? After all the years of pretending she was special, she gets a pile of junk?" Aunt Vivian giggled, pulling her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders as if the mention of grease might contaminate her. My cheeks burned crimson, the heat of embarrassment spreading across my face and neck. I felt small, dismissed, and utterly humiliated. The one man I thought genuinely cared had, in the end, publicly relegated me to the trash heap of the family's regard. The mention of the safe deposit box was almost lost in the din of the mockery. "Mr. Vance specifically stipulated," Mr. Henderson continued, cutting through the noise with surprising force, "that the toolbox must be retrieved by Miss Vance herself and opened in this office now. It is to be considered a single, indivisible inheritance tied to the contents of the safe deposit box." He said, and I quote, "Tell Alara that the real treasure is never where you expect to find it, and the true value is not in the shine, but in the rust." A heavy, industrial-looking toolbox, chipped green paint barely visible beneath a thick layer of accumulated grime, was wheeled in on a small dolly. It looked utterly out of place against the Persian rug and the antique furniture. It was hideous. It was also, undeniably, Silas. I remembered running my small hands over the cold metal 20 years ago, fascinated by the smell of machine oil and the promise of creation the tools held. Swallowing my pride and the lump in my throat, I walked toward it, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed on my back, judging my every move. The handle was cold and sticky under my fingers. The latch was stiff with rust, protesting loudly as I managed to flip it open. Inside, it was a mess. Not organized like a proper craftsman's kit, but haphazardly filled with the things Silas actually used. A worn hammer with a taped handle, several mismatched wrenches, a small collection of screws and washers in a shallow tray, and a roll of electrical tape. The family leaned forward now, morbidly curious to see the culmination of my great inheritance. "Maybe there's a gold bar under the tray," Eleanor whispered sarcastically to Marcus, who snorted. I reached into the main compartment, pushing aside the heavy tools, feeling around for anything unusual. My hand brushed against something smooth, thin, and brittle, tucked deep underneath a coiled length of old rope and a heavy rubber mallet. I pulled it out. It was a small, sealed, and slightly water-damaged envelope, the kind they use for official bank documents, tied with a piece of faded twine. My hands were shaking, not from excitement, but from the sheer weight of expectation and the need to end the public spectacle. I broke the seal, a brittle sound like old parchment tearing, and slid out the single document. It was a formal certificate, thick parchment with a distinctive gold seal that glittered faintly even in the dim light of the office. The title was printed across the top in an old-fashioned, elegant font. Stock title document. My breath hitched. My heart, which had been sinking steadily for the last hour, suddenly slammed against my ribs. It wasn't a bond or a deed to a piece of land. It wasn't a worthless novelty certificate. It was a stock title, a physical certificate representing ownership of shares in a corporation. I stared at the company name printed clearly beneath the ornate title. It was a name I recognized instantly, not from the headlines or the stock market reports, but from the forgotten dusty corners of business history. It was a name I had only ever seen referenced in academic papers about the birth of the technology sector, a company that had been an absolute powerhouse in its infancy, a true giant of innovation decades ago. It was a foundational player, a company that everyone assumed had long ago been absorbed or restructured into oblivion. The date on the document was vintage, predating the digital age of trading, from a time when these paper certificates truly were the asset. My eyes then dropped to the number printed next to shares. It wasn't a small, round number. It was a large, deeply intimidating figure, a number that immediately looked wrong, too big to be real. My hands started to sweat profusely, causing the heavy paper to slightly adhere to my skin. I instinctively kept the document angled away from the prying eyes of my family, who were now leaning in so close I could smell Marcus's overpowering cologne. Their previous smug mockery had been replaced by a tense, focused curiosity, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the strange, sudden silence that had fallen over the room as I froze, utterly immobilized by the sight of the numbers. I knew, without having to calculate the current market value, that this single piece of paper, pulled from a rusty toolbox and surrounded by mocking silence, was not just an inheritance. It was a seismic event. This was the moment everything I thought I knew about my place in the family and my future irrevocably changed. The real story, the one that Silas had so deliberately hidden, was not in the grease or the rust, but in the forgotten history of a single, brittle, golden-sealed paper. The silence was the most terrifying part. It wasn't the natural silence of a respectful room, but the stunned, suffocating quiet of predators who suddenly realized their prey might be holding a live grenade. I kept my gaze locked on the document, forcing myself to process the name of the company, Aether Dynamics. It wasn't a familiar blue-chip stock. It was a ghost from the first wave of high-tech innovation, a business that pioneered a foundational, though now obsolete, network protocol. Everyone assumed Aether Dynamics had evaporated 30 years ago. But Silas, the eternal tinkerer, the man who valued preservation, had held on to a specific class of shares, a class I now realized was special, perhaps even protected by a grandfathered clause, a relic from a forgotten time. I finally lifted my head, meeting the eyes of the solicitor, Mr. Henderson, who had watched the entire exchange with an unnerving calm. He gave me the smallest, most knowing of nods, a tiny confirmation that my worst-case scenario, that this was all some cruel final joke, was completely unfounded. "Miss Vance," Mr. Henderson said, his voice returning to its professional tenor, deliberately breaking the thick silence. "May I see the document, please?" I handed it over, my fingers sticky against the parchment. As the solicitor's gaze swept over the figures, Marcus finally broke. "What is it?" he demanded, stepping closer, his expensive suit rustling. The change in his face was dramatic. The condescension was wiped away, replaced by an expression of sharp, predatory anxiety. "Is it some kind of old bond? A collector's item? What company is that? Aether something. Never heard of it." "The company, Aether Dynamics, Mr. Vance," Henderson explained slowly, meticulously refolding the document, refusing to give Marcus a clear look at the share count, was indeed a pivotal player in the early days of networked communication. It was not absorbed or dissolved. It was restructured decades ago, its assets spun off into several different entities. However, Miss Vance's certificate represents a specific non-dilutable class of founders' shares. Shares that, to put it simply, still grant a very small but very real percentage of ownership in what is now the holding company of 3 major subsidiaries. Subsidiaries that include, he paused, delivering the corporate names like a death sentence, the current world leader in semiconductor manufacturing, a multinational telecommunications giant, and the patent holder for a fundamental piece of military-grade encryption software. The room went silent again, but this time it felt like a vacuum, the air sucked out by the sheer force of the information. Semiconductor manufacturing, telecommunications, military encryption. These weren't relics. They were titans of the modern economy. The irony hit me with the force of a physical blow. The rusty toolbox, the object of my family's supreme scorn, held the key to a colossal, modern fortune. Marcus looked physically ill. His face was pale, his jaw slack. He looked from the solicitor to the toolbox sitting innocently on the floor, and back to me. The rage and envy in his eyes were immediately apparent. "That's impossible," Marcus spat out, the words catching in his throat. Silas's wealth was all tied up in blue-chip stocks and real estate. We saw the portfolio statements. This isn't listed anywhere. It has to be a fake or worthless." "On the contrary, Mr. Vance," Henderson countered, his tone perfectly polite, but with an edge of steel. "These specific shares were held by your uncle in physical certificate form, a practice increasingly rare, but perfectly legal. They were never digitized and therefore never appeared on the automated portfolio reports. It was an off-the-books asset, known only to himself, the bank, and now Miss Vance. And as for the value," Henderson offered a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Based on a rough calculation of the current market capitalization of the holding company's subsidiaries and the percentage of equity these founder shares represent, your cousin, Miss Vance, has just inherited a stake worth well in excess of $700 million, and growing." A collective gasp went through the room, a dramatic, audible sound that was almost comical in its sudden change from laughter to shock. $700 million. The number hung in the air, a physical manifestation of power and instant reversal of fortune. I felt dizzy, my knees suddenly weak. I hadn't gone from zero to hero. I had gone from being the pathetic relative who got a rusty box to holding more wealth than the rest of the family combined, thanks to the sheer, stubborn eccentricity of my uncle. Marcus, however, was already recovering, his mind racing to damage control. The condescension was gone, replaced by a forced, sickly sweet camaraderie. He took a step toward me, hands slightly raised in a gesture of false sincerity. "Ilara, darling, why didn't you tell us you and Silas were working on something so big?" he began, his voice oily. "Always the secretive one. We're family. We need to stick together. Let me handle this. You know how complicated these old stock titles can be. I have a whole team of financial analysts. I can get you the best price. Keep it all in the family." The swiftness of his pivot was repulsive. A moment ago, I was a joke. Now I was a sudden, inconvenient challenge, a prize to be managed and, if possible, exploited. I held up a hand, stopping him mid-step. My own voice, when it came out, was steady, surprisingly firm, a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Thank you for the offer, Marcus," I said, meeting his gaze evenly. But Uncle Silas knew exactly what he was doing. He left the toolbox to me, and inside the toolbox, he left this. He knew I could handle a challenge. "And Mr. Henderson will handle the transfer and valuation process." A cold, hard look settled in Marcus's eyes, the true reflection of his greed shining through. The fight had just begun, and I knew with absolute certainty that this inheritance, pulled from a humble, rusty container, was going to define the future battlefield of my life with this family. The toolbox was not just a container, it was a symbol and a weapon. The remaining minutes in the solicitor's office dissolved into a blur of forced smiles and thinly veiled threats. Marcus and Aunt Vivian attempted a disastrous tag-team approach, alternating between gushing over my sudden, shocking good fortune and patronizingly questioning my ability to manage such a complex financial instrument. "Honestly, Alara," Vivian whispered, leaning in too close, her perfume suffocatingly sweet, "you've never even managed a simple IRA. This Aether Dynamics thing, it sounds so esoteric. What if you make a mistake? What if you lose it all? We wouldn't want Silas's legacy to just vanish overnight, would we? We are trying to protect you from yourself." I listened patiently, simply repeating that Mr. Henderson was handling all preliminary steps. Their obvious attempts to intimidate me into signing over control or seeking their expert guidance only solidified my resolve. Whatever Silas had done, he had done to deliberately bypass them, and I would honor that. As soon as the meeting was officially concluded, I made my escape, clutching the newly secured documents, now safely transferred into a crisp, official folder, and crucially, the rusty toolbox itself. Henderson had insisted I take the box, citing Silas's specific instructions about its significance. The weight of the metal felt comforting, a physical tether to the man who had seen something in me my family never had. Marcus trailed me all the way to the elevator, his voice shifting to low, intense persuasion. He was no longer trying to manage me. He was trying to buy me. "Ilara, I'll be frank. These shares are an anomaly. They create an imbalance in the estate's tax structure. Let me give you a clean, manageable sum, say $50 million, tax-free, for the shares. That's more than enough for you. You can live comfortably forever, and I can deal with the headache of restructuring Aether Dynamics. $50 million. A life-changing amount. Yet the real value was over $700 million, and his offer was insulting, a transparent attempt to exploit my perceived naivete. I just shook my head, stepped into the elevator, and watched his mask of civility shatter as the doors closed. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity, all conducted in stealth. Mr. Henderson was an invaluable ally, a man of discreet efficiency, who seemed to genuinely enjoy facilitating Silas's final, grand joke on his entitled relatives. He revealed the first major twist Silas had engineered. The stock title document, while representing a massive share, also came with a seat on the board of the Aether Holding Group. It wasn't just money, it was power. Silas hadn't just given me wealth. He had given me a voice in the very corporations my cousins ran their livelihoods on. The realization was staggering. I, who had been mocked for taking an old toolbox, now had the authority to walk into their high-rise boardrooms and demand accountability. But the most pressing revelation, the one that truly drove home the depth of Silas's foresight, came during a deep dive into the history of Aether Dynamics. Henderson had managed to retrieve the original company charter and bylaws, bound in leather and gathering dust in a remote archive. Most founder shares were non-dilutable, but these were something more specific. Silas had secured a tiny amendment, a forgotten clause that stated if the cumulative value of the Aether shares exceeded a predetermined threshold, a threshold that had been triggered by the recent, explosive growth in the semiconductor subsidiary. The original certificate holder gained an extraordinary and specific privilege: the right to veto any single major acquisition, merger, or sale initiated by the holding company for a period of 1 calendar year following the successful transfer of the shares. This was not just power. It was a potential nuclear deterrent. Silas had given me the ability to stop my cousins, or anyone else on the current board, from executing a major deal if I felt it betrayed the foundational spirit of the original Aether Dynamics. It was the ultimate check and balance, hidden for decades in the most unlikely of places. I now understood the true meaning of Silas's quote, "The real treasure is never where you expect to find it, and the true value is not in the shine, but in the rust." The box was rusty, the document was old, but the power it contained was absolutely modern and completely destructive to the plans of the current corporate players. I spent days absorbing the history, poring over old blueprints and articles that detailed Aether Dynamics' initial vision. It wasn't about quick profits. It was about open source collaboration and ethical technology development. The modern subsidiaries, particularly the telecommunications giant, had drifted far from that ethos, often engaging in practices that were legally sound but ethically questionable. I realized Silas didn't just want me to be rich, he wanted me to be the guardian of his past ideals. This inheritance wasn't a passive gift, it was a mandate. My first board meeting was scheduled for the following week. I had to make an entrance. I couldn't walk in as the bewildered niece. I had to walk in as the unexpected $700 million owner and the holder of the Veto Clause. I needed to send a clear message. The message wasn't going to be delivered through a bespoke suit or a fancy watch. It was going to be delivered through the very object they had mocked. I called a specialist. My plan was to transform the rusty toolbox not into something beautiful, but into something symbolic, a constant, heavy reminder of where my authority truly came from. I was preparing for war, armed with nothing but my uncle's foresight, a piece of old paper, and a very, very rusty toolbox. The anticipation of seeing the looks on my family's faces when I walked into that boardroom, not just rich but powerful, was the only thing fueling me through the intensive crash course in corporate law and finance I was taking. I was ready to play Silas's game. The day of the board meeting arrived with a palpable sense of drama, at least on my side. I had dressed simply, choosing professional but unflashy attire, a calculated move to contrast sharply with the opulent finery I knew the rest of the board, particularly Marcus, would be sporting. I wanted their focus to be on my presence, not my presentation. But the true star of my entrance was waiting in the car, the toolbox. I had retrieved it from the specialist just hours before. I hadn't asked them to restore it, polish it, or repaint it. I had asked them to stabilize the rust, clean the interior thoroughly, and most importantly, install a bespoke, high-tech biometric lock on the outside and line the interior with custom-molded, fireproof foam designed to perfectly cradle a single document, the Aether Dynamics stock title. It still looked exactly like a battered, rusty 40-year-old toolbox, but its functionality was now state-of-the-art. It was the physical embodiment of Silas's philosophy, value hidden beneath a deliberately humble exterior. Walking into the high-rise corporate headquarters of Aether Holding Group was an experience in sensory overload, all polished granite, blinding chrome, and hushed, reverent tones. I felt a surge of confidence, a quiet strength born from knowing I was an unexpected, unpredictable force. I was directed to the executive conference room, a place of intimidating power. Marcus was already there, holding court at the massive oval table, surrounded by his hand-picked executives and a few bewildered-looking non-family board members. He saw me enter and, in a breathtaking display of transactional charisma, instantly switched from discussing revenue targets to a performance of fraternal affection. "Ilara, there you are! We were just talking about you!" he boomed, standing up and sweeping his arm toward a vacant seat near the foot of the table. "Come, sit down. Everyone, this is my cousin, Ilara Vance, Silas's beneficiary. She's here to take her official seat. We're so delighted to have her presence. We're working on a few complicated issues today, darling, so just observe and absorb. We'll catch you up on the simple matters later." He was deliberately framing my presence as ceremonial, an inconvenience they had to tolerate before getting back to the adult business. I smiled, a genuine cold smile, and ignored the seat he indicated. Instead, I walked directly to the head of the table near the main display screen and pulled out the chair directly opposite Marcus. As I did so, The security guard I had discreetly arranged to bring the toolbox into the building appeared at the door, carrying the heavy, rusty metal container. The guard placed it with a soft thud on the polished mahogany surface right next to my chair. The contrast between the antique rust and the gleaming wood was jarring. The collective gaze of the room snapped to the box, and then to me. Marcus's face froze, his patronizing smile dissolving into a look of sheer, confused fury. "What in the— Alara, what is that?" he demanded, his voice dropping from the boardroom-friendly boom to a tight, aggressive whisper. "This, Marcus," I said, resting my hand lightly on the cool metal, the biometric lock flashing a tiny green light, "is the toolbox my Uncle Silas bequeathed to me. As the official holder of the founder's stock and the newest member of this board, I find it an appropriate and necessary piece of equipment for my work here. After all, the value is in the rust, not the shine." I used his own dismissive words against him, watching him flush a deep crimson. The other board members, initially shocked, were now deeply intrigued, whispering among themselves about the strange young woman and her antique baggage. The meeting began, and I followed Marcus's patronizing advice, staying silent for the first 2 hours, listening intently, letting them believe I was overwhelmed. They discussed quarterly reports, minor acquisitions, and structural adjustments. Everything was handled with an air of smooth, choreographed inevitability designed to shut out any real debate. But then, the final item on the agenda appeared on the main screen. Resolution 7.4b, approval of the proposed acquisition of Project Chimera by Telco Sub. My heart hammered. I had spent the last week researching Project Chimera. It was a groundbreaking but financially precarious startup that held the patent for a revolutionary open-source communication platform. Exactly the kind of ethical, collaborative technology Silas had championed decades ago. Telco Sub, the telecommunications giant controlled by the holding group, was proposing to buy it for a massive price, not to utilize the technology, but to immediately shelve and bury it, eliminating a potential low-cost competitor before it could threaten their market dominance. This was precisely the kind of self-serving, anti-competitive maneuver Silas had feared. Marcus introduced the resolution with his usual practiced ease, citing market necessity and competitive advantage. He was about to call the vote, clearly expecting unanimous approval, when I finally spoke, my voice cutting cleanly and distinctly through the post-lunch lull. "Excuse me, Marcus. Before the vote," I began, leaning forward slightly, "I believe I have a question regarding the ethical and strategic alignment of this specific acquisition with the original charter of Aether Dynamics." Marcus's head snapped toward me, his eyes blazing with annoyance. "Alara, this is a multi-million-dollar deal. It's vetted. This is not the time for sentimentality. We are voting on competitive strategy, not philosophy. Please, stick to the basics." "The basics, as I understand them," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level, "include the preservation of the founding principles, as articulated in the Aether Charter. Specifically, the commitment to the advancement of open, ethical communication protocols. Project Chimera represents exactly that. Your plan to acquire and bury it, however, represents the direct opposite. Furthermore, under Article 12, Subsection D of the original Aether Dynamics stock title C-Class Holder Rights, the class I now possess, I am vested with the authority to exercise a one-time veto on any single major acquisition that I deem to be contrary to the company's foundational mission." I let the sentence hang in the stunned silence. I had dropped the final, hidden bomb. Marcus gaped at me, his face devoid of color. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no longer a game. I reached down, my hand steady, and pressed the biometric scanner on the rusty toolbox. The lid popped open with a quiet, confident hiss, revealing the pristine, golden-sealed stock title document resting on its plush, fireproof foam. My power wasn't a rumor or a file on a computer. It was a physical thing, resting in a rusty box, and it was about to change the direction of a billion-dollar deal. Marcus finally found his voice, a strangled, furious sound that barely concealed his panic. "Veto power? That's ridiculous. That clause was grandfathered out decades ago. It's an archaic piece of paper, Alara. You cannot legally exercise a veto on a deal of this magnitude based on a footnote from 1985. You're bluffing! His face was blotchy with rage, and he looked ready to leap across the table and physically snatch the document from the toolbox. The executives around him sat rigidly, observing the escalating public meltdown of their boss. I didn't argue with Marcus. I turned my attention to the company's general counsel, Mr. Sterling, a thin man who had been meticulously taking notes and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Mr. Sterling, I addressed him calmly. As the general counsel of Aether Holding Group, can you confirm the validity and current legal standing of Article 12, subsection D, of the original Aether Dynamics stock title C-class holder rights, particularly concerning the one-time acquisition veto clause, activated by the triggering event outlined in the subsequent Article 12, subsection E, which, as we know, was satisfied last month? Sterling visibly swallowed, his loyalty to Marcus battling. With his professional obligation to the law, he glanced at Marcus, who was silently shaking his head in a desperate plea. Sterling took a deep breath. The clause is technically extant, Miss Vance. It was never formally revoked, though it was universally considered inert due to the extreme financial threshold required for activation. The recent surge in the semiconductor subsidiary's valuation did, as you stated, satisfy the conditions of subsection E. You are, at this moment, legally entitled to exercise a single veto on a proposed major acquisition. He delivered the final sentence as if extracting a painful tooth. The look of utter betrayal Marcus shot Sterling could have melted chrome. For the rest of the board, the realization sank in. This was not a spoiled niece making noise. This was a strategic blockade orchestrated by Silas from beyond the grave. The toolbox wasn't just my inheritance. It was the mechanism of the coup. Then, as the holder of the stock title, I continued, placing my hand firmly on the document inside the box, a silent, dramatic gesture of sealing the decision. I formally and irrevocably exercise my one-time veto against Resolution 7.4b, the proposed acquisition of Project Chimera by Telco Sub. My reason is simple. The proposed action of purchasing the technology to bury it violates the core principles of ethical technological advancement enshrined in the Aether Dynamics Charter. The subsequent hour was chaos. Marcus launched a furious tirade, demanding immediate appeals, threatening lawsuits against me, against Sterling, against the very fabric of the corporate structure. He accused me of being a saboteur, an agent of rival companies, a reckless fool who didn't understand the complex interplay of market forces. He painted a picture of economic ruin that my sentimental foolishness would cause. I sat there, unflappable, allowing him to exhaust his fury. I didn't need to yell. I had the law and Silas's foresight on my side. I learned another crucial lesson that day. Financial power is not just about the money. It's about the time it buys you, the resources it unlocks, and the people it brings to your side. Mr. Henderson, having anticipated this exact scenario, had provided me with a comprehensive legal brief covering the veto power, and I had simply read the prepared legal language. I wasn't just guessing, I was executing a carefully laid plan. When Marcus finally collapsed back into his chair, sputtering in defeat, I addressed the remaining board members, who were now looking at me with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. This veto is not an act of spite, gentlemen. It is a necessary reset. Uncle Silas believed in the power of ethical innovation. Project Chimera is exactly that. Telco Sub has stifled growth and operated with impunity for too long. My objective here is not just to preserve my uncle's legacy, but to force this holding group to reevaluate its direction. I propose a new initiative. Instead of burying Project Chimera, Aether Holding Group will partner with them, offering funding and infrastructure, not acquisition. We will launch a new open-source technology division focused on truly innovative, ethical communication systems. It is the future, and it is the past. The proposal was radical, a complete reversal of corporate strategy, but it held a certain, undeniable logic. It was a chance to harness the massive capital of the holding group to achieve actual technological breakthroughs rather than just market monopolization. By the end of the meeting, the narrative had completely shifted. I wasn't the naive niece who inherited a novelty. I was the unforeseen power broker who had just executed a $700 million move and now controlled the strategic direction of the entire group. As I rose to leave, Marcus finally spoke, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all bravado. "This isn't over, Ilara. You think one lucky piece of paper makes you invincible? This is our family's domain. We will find every loophole, every clause. We will crush Project Chimera, and we will crush you. You just declared war." I stopped at the door, turning back to face him, the rusty toolbox secure under my arm. "War, Marcus? No. Uncle Silas just gave me the right tools to clean up your mess. And unlike you, I know the difference between value and shine." I walked out, leaving the stunned silence of the boardroom echoing behind me. But I knew the real fight had only just begun. The irony was sweet, but the danger was real. They had mocked the rust. Now they would learn to fear what the rust protected. The immediate aftermath of the veto was predictably brutal. Marcus and his allies initiated a full-scale legal assault, attempting to challenge the legitimacy of the C-Class shares and the antiquity of the Aether Charter. They argued that Silas, in his final years, must have been mentally incompetent, deliberately manipulating the will to cause distress. Their attacks were relentless, filling the corporate news cycle and causing momentary, significant turbulence in the stock value of the holding group's subsidiaries. But Henderson and I were ready. Silas had anticipated this too. The legal brief he had commissioned years ago was flawless, its arguments airtight, covering every conceivable challenge to the veto clause and my ownership. We didn't just win the initial injunctions, we crushed them, forcing Marcus and his team to retract their spurious claims and absorb massive legal fees. The greatest twist, however, was not in the legal battles, but in the revelation of the toolbox's secondary purpose. I had asked Mr. Henderson to thoroughly examine the toolbox for any additional items, suspecting that Silas, ever the strategist, might have hidden a final message or safeguard. Beneath the specialized foam lining that held the stock title, the forensic team discovered a small, almost invisible compartment sealed by a tiny, soldered piece of metal, cleverly disguised by a patina of genuine rust. Inside, wrapped in a thin layer of protective plastic, was a handwritten letter from Silas, dated just 2 weeks before his death. The letter was the final, devastating piece of his legacy. It was addressed only to me, and it contained a detailed personal account of Marcus's and Vivian's decades-long pattern of exploiting Silas's generosity and manipulating the family holdings, including a massive illegal shell scheme executed 10 years ago that stripped millions of dollars from an educational trust fund Silas had established. He had documented everything meticulously: dates, transfer numbers, bank names, and the names of the co-conspirators. He hadn't just secured my financial future, he had armed me with the evidence needed to clean up the ethical rot at the heart of the family business. "Ilara," the letter concluded, the familiar, slightly shaky script radiating a final, resolute strength. "I gave you the rusty toolbox not just as a symbol, but as a test of character. The document inside grants you the power. The documentation inside gives you the moral mandate. The true value of any inheritance is what you choose to build with it. Use the tools wisely. Show them that true value is never about the shine of instant wealth, but the structural integrity you find when you scrape away the rust and corruption. The choice now is yours." I was stunned. Silas hadn't just created an obstacle for Marcus. He had handed me the smoking gun, turning the inheritance from a defense into an offense. My family had mocked the rusty box, but inside, I had found not just $1 billion stock certificate, but the absolute truth, the ugly, compelling truth about their greed. I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't want to simply get rich. I wanted to honor Silas's vision for the Aether Charter. I called a private meeting with the non-family board members, those who had looked intrigued during my veto. I presented them with Silas's letter and the meticulous evidence of the 10-year-old fraud. The effect was immediate and decisive. When they realized the depth of Marcus's criminality and the potential liability to the holding group, they quickly and quietly formed a coalition. The final scene unfolded not in a grand boardroom, but in a small, private emergency session called by the now empowered coalition. Marcus and Vivian, Confident they had weathered the initial legal storm, walked in expecting a minor concession. Instead, they were faced with the evidence. When I finished reading key excerpts from Silas's letter, my voice steady, devoid of emotion, quoting bank account numbers and dates, the fight drained out of them entirely. The shock of being caught by a dead man through a rusty toolbox they had so carelessly dismissed was absolute. Within hours, Marcus and Vivian were placed on mandatory leave, pending a full criminal investigation initiated by the coalition. The embarrassment was total, the disgrace irreversible. I stood there, watching the destruction of their decades of calculated greed. I didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of completion. I had fulfilled Silas's mandate. The next day, I officially partnered with Project Chimera, providing the funding and infrastructure required to launch the ethical, open-source division that Silas had dreamed of. The rusty toolbox, now a symbol of corporate reform, sat prominently on the corner of my new, much more humble desk in the office I established for the new division, a constant reminder that the tools for true power are often overlooked, disguised in the mundane. My family taught me that day that they value gold. Silas taught me to value iron. They mocked the rust, but the rust was my armor, and the truth hidden beneath it was my ultimate weapon. I took my inheritance, a simple, battered toolbox, and used it to not just change my life, but to change the direction of an entire corporation, proving that the things people dismiss often hold the greatest value, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to pick up the tools and start the real work.